I accepted the job in New Orleans and I traveled down to the city. I assumed that I would be doing a very specific kind of work. And it was work that I had been doing in Atlanta, where I was working with rape crisis centers and I was going into minority communities, refugee and immigrant communities, and I was making sure that victim protection services, the domestic violence shelters, were available to women in those communities. And it was work that to me was what I was trying to do to help people who needed assistance from the government and who had somehow been victimized by someone or were in danger and their children were in danger and they needed a safe place. I was looking for that kind of work, and I heard about what was supposed to be a police community liaison job in New Orleans, and I had a chance to live there. So I contacted the people at the office. I had no idea what ACORN was, and I was given the job. And I assumed I had been hired to work this job for the summer. I traveled down to New Orleans and I walked into the office and I spoke to some of the people who were working there, and I immediately realized that they weren't doing what they had advertised. They had college students from around the country living in and near the projects in a very dangerous part of the city. And they were sending the students out during the day to organize the communities. And what that meant was that they were sending college students door to door in some of the most dangerous public housing projects in New Orleans. And when somebody answered the door, they would ask them questions about whether they were satisfied with their housing, whether they wanted more from the government, whether they were angry about the way the police were treating them. And they would basically try to get people to sign up to work on ACORN's agenda. And that's what community organizing is. And Barack Obama talks about this at length in his autobiography. He talks about it as a very positive experience, that he was a college student who got involved with these organizations, and he was going into poor neighborhoods, and he was trying to see what these people needed from the government. I could see the value of doing that to a certain degree, but I could tell that in this office in New Orleans, they were really trying to get people angry at the police, not working with them to solve the crime problems that were plaguing New Orleans at the time, but actually trying to drive wedges between community members and the people who are supposed to be protecting them from the criminals. And this is what ACORN does with the communities that they go into and they quote unquote organize. The end goal for them is not to solve problems. The end goal is to radicalize communities. And I think in a very deep way, they know perfectly well that they're harming the people that they bring these messages to. But it doesn't matter to them because their real goals are really political. And when I walked away quickly from that, because I had already seen that type of behavior in Atlanta, and I didn't want to be a part of it. And I knew it wouldn't be helping the person who had to call the police officer at 1 o'clock in the morning because somebody was breaking into their office. They were trying to make it harder for the police to be able to help these people. And I was deeply offended by it, and I walked away. The New Orleans office had ties to the Chicago office, where Barack Obama had connections to them, had ties to the organization. And when he first came on the political scene, when he was running for president and he was in the primaries against Hillary Clinton, and I first heard about his background and I looked into the jobs he had held, and his life and my life we'd had a lot of similar experiences in terms of the types of groups that we worked with. And I realized, I think more than anybody I knew at the time, exactly what he was made of and exactly what he was willing to accept and exactly the type of politics that he represented. Unless they happened to take the path I took and actually experience these folks firsthand, there's an enormous credibility gap where it's extremely difficult to explain to people exactly what these types of political operatives want for America. And if you haven't had a personal experience with it, if you haven't seen block grants disappearing into people's pockets, if you haven't seen the types of programs that sound very good in public, help the poor, heal the communities, improve the landscape, save the environment. If you don't really, if that's all you're hearing about those types of political programs, they sound very benign and they sound like they're helping people. And I think you have to, if you're my age, you had to have been on the ground and be seeing what was actually going on behind the scenes as the Democratic Party, and especially the progressive left, became more and more confident in their radicalization. And so I have to say, when I first heard about Barack Obama and I first heard he was associated with Acorn, I thought back to that day in New Orleans, where I walked into that office and I had been lied to, and the people there had no interest in actually helping the poor. And the people there were actual revolutionaries who wanted to destroy the American middle class. And I count myself very lucky now. I felt like a rube then, having traveled all the way from Atlanta to New Orleans to work with people whom I didn't know enough about. And I had never heard of Acorn before. And it just wasn't the sort of thing that was on anybody's radar. But I'm so grateful for that experience now, because it told me early on what Barack Obama was really about. Because nobody, and he's a smart guy, nobody that smart could walk into that arena and not know what they were walking into. And the more I read about him and the more that I knew about his background, I realized that he had been raised in these circles and he knew perfectly well what these organizations meant. And he doesn't have the ability to plead innocence about this. He knew what he was getting into when he worked with these people in Chicago. And he knew what he was doing when he started out his political career and he associated with them. And with his academic background and with his accomplishments, he could have chosen to be a very different type of political operative. He could have chosen a very different political career. I think we have to give Barack Obama credit for the choices that he made. And we have to know exactly what those choices really mean.
And I definitely welcome Acorn's input. You don't have to ask me about that. I'm going to call you, even if you didn't ask me. When I ran Project Vote, voter registration drive in Illinois, Acorn was smack dab in the middle of it. Once I was elected, there wasn't a campaign that Acorn worked on down in Springfield that I wasn't right there with you. Since I've been in the United States Senate, I've been always a partner with Acorn as well. I've been fighting with Acorn, alongside Acorn, on the issues you care about my entire career.
Acorn was a follow-on organization, as I said, to the NWRO, and they continued to push for the guaranteed national income, although they did it in a much smaller, behind-the-scenes kind of manner. They went for local and state ordinances, minimum wage ordinances, but they also became involved in housing. An organization called Acorn Housing was founded shortly after the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act passed by Jimmy Carter. And the Community Reinvestment Act essentially forced banks to make loans to customers of questionable creditworthiness. The argument from the left had been that banks were discriminating against blacks by carving out entire inner city regions and making them off limits to loan. Is a practice called redlining. What the left doesn't say was that redlining was a requirement under the FHA founded by FDR, because the FHA would not guarantee any loans to uncreditworthy customers. And so the FHA told the banks, you cannot provide mortgages to anybody within this geographic region or that geographic region. And it had a huge negative impact on inner cities. Most people don't know that, and the left doesn't want you to know that, because their whole argument is it's the greedy capitalist profiteers who are capitalists, racists, sexists, imperialists. But it really had to do with the government, once again, getting involved where it shouldn't be involved. Redlining had been discontinued after 1968, and it was a very thin argument the left made. But like many things they do, it found the sympathetic people in the Congress, so they were able to pass the Community Reinvestment Act. With the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act, groups like Acorn began demanding that banks make loans to people who essentially just weren't creditworthy. And Acorn began an organization called Acorn Housing, where they actually promoted and marketed these loans. And the Community Reinvestment Act and what followed, that was really the genesis of the financial crisis we're in the middle of right now. Because the leftist groups, Acorn was a big one, but it wasn't the only one. There were a lot of other leftist groups also pushing for these risky, high-risk subprime mortgages. And they also lobbied increasingly. They lobbied the federal government, they lobbied state governments to make further changes to strengthen the Community Reinvestment Act and push banks even harder. They didn't have a lot of luck in the Reagan administration, but when Clinton was elected, Clinton began tightening the screws on banks. And significantly, in the early 1990s, they passed a law that made the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, responsible for underwriting these subprime mortgages. Now, banks had been very reluctant to do this, as you might imagine, because these were not creditworthy customers, but they were being increasingly pushed by radicals in Congress, and now with this new radical Clinton administration, being pushed by the administration, Janet Reno, tightening the screws on them, threatening them if they didn't underwrite more of these mortgages. But at the same time, they made it easy for them. They passed this law that allowed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to underwrite the risk for these mortgages. So it was a classic case of privatizing the profits while socializing the risk. With this new law, with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac underwriting these high-risk mortgages, all the risk fell now on the backs of taxpayers. And Bill Clinton promoted this. Andrew Cuomo, the housing secretary at the time, said, "We recognize that this is going to increase foreclosures, this is going to increase the default rate, but we think it's a worthwhile social goal anyway." And that was the real genesis of the vast expansion in subprime mortgages that led ultimately to the housing bubble and the completely predictable housing crash that followed, and the economic downturn we now are suffering as a result. This was all Cloward pivot strategy on steroids. And it was promoted by Acorn, it was promoted by other radical leftist groups. Interestingly, one of the lawyers working for Acorn at the time promoting all these things was Barack Obama.
In 2007, we were working on the campaign, and as far back as 2006, there were Acorn documents that state Obama in 2008. We already knew in 2006 that Obama was going to get it. I always call Hillary the red herring because it made it look like it was actually fair, but they all wanted him to come from behind and have it pushed. And some of you may remember, in the black community, they were saying Obama wasn't black enough. They didn't like him. They had to go out there and do this big PR push and make it about race. All of a sudden, you saw Obama hanging out with the rappers, and he was on the black morning shows, and we're talking about race more and more. And they did that because they needed to get the black people invested in their person. They called it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get Obama elected. And that's because they were pushing for ideas like universal health care, the Employee Free Choice Act, cap and trade. If you go and you Google Acorn's People's Platform, that's exactly, it mirrors exactly Obama's agenda. That's what they were trying to pass. So in November of 2007, I attended a meeting in Arkansas. And Zach Paulette, who was the executive director of Acorn, he gets up and he says, "You know what? I supervised Obama in the 90s, and Acorn produces leaders." And as a liberal, I'm sitting there and I'm all excited because what he's saying is, you too, a community organizer, can be the next president of the United States. And I believe that. So I went back to DC, and I'm sitting at my desk on the right there on the Capitol Hill office, and the phone rings. And it's the Obama campaign. And they asked me, is this a project vote that Obama worked for in the 90s? Now, the reason why they asked is because there's also a Project Vote Smart. And sometimes we get their mail and we get their phone calls. But once I confirmed that it was indeed the project vote they were looking for, I got excited and I started typing an email to my superiors, letting them know that the Obama campaign had contacted Project Vote and why. They wanted to talk about some of the questions that were coming out about his history as a community organizer. No one said anything to me for a few days, and then my supervisor calls me into the office. She gives me the impression that I probably shouldn't have put that in an email and had a record, but she didn't chastise me. She just told me next time to call someone. Then she hands me a black and white USB drive, and she tells me to go back into my office and start targeting the maxed out presidential donors on that list. What we were going to do with that donor list that had been given to us from the Obama campaign was to target any donors that could no longer give to him, but could give to Acorn to get Obama elected. Not only were we coordinating with the campaign, but it was in violation of FEC rules. At the time, I really didn't realize all of this, but as I started going through the list and putting it together, I knew what was going on. We were cheating. And if your team is winning but is cheating, is it really winning? And that's what I started to try to think about, because I had tried to come forward on Acorn before. Back into early 2007, before Obama, before all of this happened, I had come back from maternity leave and things were worse than before. And I decided I was going to tell somebody about what was going on. We were getting people jailed left and right on these voter registration fraud charges, and it wasn't right. So I contacted the Employment Policies Institute in maybe March or April of 2007, and I told them what I knew. And the guy, his name is Brett Jacobson. He now writes for Big Government. He took the call, and he told me right then and there, he said, I could probably mine you for information and go forward and expose Acorn. He said, you're going down a dangerous road, and you just had a baby. Why don't you call me back after you're no longer with Acorn, and we can see what we can do to help you. He was looking out for me. You know how many people would have took that opportunity and just ran with it and never explained to me the dangers and the stuff that was involved in that? And even when I came forward in 2008, I still didn't know. It happens as you go along, and you realize that you're dealing with people who have staked the entire decades on this. When they stopped bombing the FBI buildings in the 60s, they assimilated into American society. They went into academia, they went into the nonprofit world, and yes, they went into the Republican Party, because that's how they were being funded during the Bush years, and they were able to do all of this activity without people paying attention. So they had a lot at stake here, and no one wanted this story to get out. So in 2008, in July, I started working with the New York Times. As a liberal from Alabama, the New York Times was like up here. It was the paper of record. I had no inkling that I would have a problem telling my story. So I started working as a confidential source with Stephanie Strong. I turned over all types of information regarding the money laundering, regarding what could possibly be RICO violations, and the illicit coordination between the campaigns. Strong had all of this beginning in July of 2008. Every time she wrote a story, it was watered down. And she would tell me things like, oh, we didn't have enough space, or my editor wouldn't let me put this in there. And I still was starting to not believe her. But once again, being a liberal, this is the New York Times. Why would they kill a story if it's true? This is around the same time they ran a story about McCain, where they said he was having an affair with an anonymous source as the only quote there. But I was willing to come forward and give my name and put it out there, and because I wanted, this is going to sound crazy, I really at the time still thought Obama was a good person. I voted for him and I wanted him to win, but I didn't want him to be controlled by Acorn because I knew what their agenda was. And I figured if I exposed Acorn, Obama would be able to govern effectively. So I kept giving her information and letting her know, yes, I was a Democrat and I wasn't going after Obama. I really wanted just to expose what was happening because they were using Black people. And people get mad when I say this and they say it's racist or it's not, whatever. But we called it inside of Acorn Operation Darky Shield. And the reason why, and I say it sounds horrible, but it's a South Park movie from about early in the 2000s, the ones with Saddam Hussein. So Chef and the kids are they're on the field, and Chef goes out there and he gets shot first, and then you see the guy and he pulls all the other troops and tells them to go. And that's exactly what Acorn would do. They would put the blackest people, and this is horrible, and I'm telling the truth, the blackest people they could find. If their person was toothless, they wanted them on TV. We would bring white people that have been affected by foreclosures to these meetings, and they would get mad at us because they don't want white faces. They want Black faces on TV. They want to make it a Black issue because that's how they operate. So if you say anything about what they're doing, about their foreclosure activities, about the fact that some of these loans are being backed by food stamps and under the table money, they can scream racism immediately. And that usually shuts down the conversation, and then they keep operating in the background. So every time they put a black face out there, it was almost guaranteeing that whatever project they were working on was going to be ignored, whether it be lead paint when they're out there protesting in front of Sherwin-Williams, or taking money from H&R Block and Jackson Hewitt and using it to build their offices and add new computers. They were all doing this under the guise of helping people. And that's what I wanted to expose. So we're going to fast forward to maybe about September of 2008. I, at this point, did not trust Stephanie Strom at all. And I reached out to Michelle Malkin, of all people. I always thought Malkin was a little scary. I mean, as a liberal, she terrified me. But she was the only person that got it right about Acorn. So I started sending her stuff. And unfortunately, Malkin didn't catch on until after the election. But another writer did, and his name was Mike Gaynor. He's out of New York. He's a 67-year-old Orthodox Catholic lawyer. And if you understand my background as a black woman coming up, a black Catholic in the South, he's totally opposite of anyone that I would ever trust or consider a friend. But as all of this was unfolding, I was telling him what was going on with the New York Times. And he just kept telling me, keep telling the truth, and you can just keep me updated. And as soon as I told him what was going on, he told me you need to reach out to Michelle Malkin again. He put me in touch with Laura Ingraham and a host of other people. But I didn't want to deal with Fox News and that side because, hey, they're racist. They don't like black people. You know? Why would I go over there with the story? So I'm still working with Stephanie Strom. October 22nd, 2008. I'm giving my daughter a bath and my phone rings. I can't get to it because she's squirming all over the place. So I come back and I check the voicemail. It's Stephanie Strom, and she's told me that her editors have told her to stand down from the story. This is 2 days before she was coming to DC to get additional evidence that proved that this was all tied in. So I called Mr. Gaynor, and then I called Stephanie back. And this is one of those conversations that you never forget. And I asked her why, when I was willing to come forward, when she had all of this evidence, when she had other employees that were willing to corroborate my story of a meeting between Acorn and the Obama campaign. And she told me that it was the New York Times policy not to print a game changer that close to the election for either side. I know. I was talking about disillusioned and hurt and a little angry because she waited that close to the election, and I realized it was because they were in the tank for Obama.
The mainstream media gave Obama such a pass. I suppose it's not surprising that people didn't know what they were getting when they voted for him, because there was no vetting among them. And the media at the time, the mainstream media at the time, it was just a few years ago, but the bloggers who have become household names today, the alternative voices on the internet that now have daily content, even though it was just a few years ago, they weren't really on the scene yet. I think it would have been a very different election. I don't think that Obama would have been successful if people were using internet news sources the way they are today, because the traditional media certainly didn't vet him, and the traditional media is certainly still so enamored of him that you're not seeing the types of stories that need to be being told in those places. This is going to be a very different election because now there's a multitude of voices. Unfortunately, some of those voices are voices that are being subsidized by George Soros, and he's got a tremendously large media empire. People don't usually think of him as being a media mogul, but he really is the equivalent of the big media moguls. He not only has a presence online with a number of organizations he underwrites, he also underwrites documentaries and other types of media that end up in educational settings, that end up in classrooms. And he subsidizes a surprising number of books written by academicians that are then promoted as neutral, objective academic sources on social issues ranging from crime sentencing to the green economy. So every year, when you look at George Soros's tax returns for the Open Society Foundations, every year there are literally dozens of individual grants that he makes to people who are either in academia or are working as journalists in order for them to complete book projects. And when those books get written, they're out there defining the issues, but they're very careful not to promote them as products of George Soros's media empire. And especially in the world of criminal justice, you can see that a surprising percentage of the best-selling books or the most respected books coming out of the field of criminology are actually the products of George Soros grants. So these are other ways that he's manipulating policy. He's doing it by paying specific scholars to produce specific works. And he's also paying for documentary work that is promoting his vision of drug legalization, that is promoting his vision of America as a force not for good in the world, but for bad in the world. And once he's in a lot of ways, George Soros has learned how to be a modest man. He doesn't insist that his contribution to these projects be emphasized when the books or the documentaries come out. So in order to find out who he's paying and where the money is going, you have to go directly to the Open Society Foundations and see what they subsidized. And there's an entire story there about the Recovery Act. And this is a story that the mainstream media has really fallen down on. There are a couple of green jobs programs that failed so spectacularly that they got media attention. But there are dozens and dozens of other Recovery Act expenditures that came about after Soros gave seed money to radical left organizations in order to try to position themselves to get that money. And in many of these cases, they had to do with green jobs boondoggles. In other cases, they had to do with mortgage relief that was directed at just a small group of people. And there really hasn't even begun to be an accounting of how much money ended up in the pockets of professional activists who had previously been funded by George Soros in order to ask for that Recovery Act funding. So there's a strong connection between Soros and the wormholes that the Recovery Act money disappeared down. And there has been precious little in the mainstream media about this. There are literally thousands of business journalists out there who somehow have managed to completely miss the connection between the Open Societies Foundation giving out grants to people to demand equity in the distribution of Recovery Act funds or other benign sounding language, and money going into the pockets of professional activists from the American taxpayers. Soros was clearly aware of the way the Recovery Act was going to help revitalize the left, just as he was helping revitalize the left. And I think that he and Obama, if the first shot in the arm for the fading left in the 90s was the money coming from George Soros, the second shot in the arm was money that got directed at the left through the Recovery Act. So you could say that Obama followed in Soros's footsteps with the Recovery Act in raining down resources onto an otherwise sort of moribund left wing and growing it back to the size that it's at today. And I'm continually surprised when I look at organizations that I knew the people, I knew the groups 20 years ago, and their membership was aging, they weren't growing, they weren't appealing to people in my generation, people who were born in the middle of the 60s and the late 60s. We were a very apolitical generation in a number of ways. But now, just a decade later, the left is alive and well. And no matter how much it doesn't really represent the desires of the American public, they've got resources that I don't think they could have dreamed of a decade ago. And for that, you can thank George Soros, and you can also thank Barack Obama. He's been a very, very effective spokesperson for these causes. George Soros is the godfather of the far left. The organizations that nurtured Obama through his years in Chicago who nurtured him as he rose in the political scene in the Chicago Senate and then the Senate. Those organizations that he identifies with are the very organizations that George Soros is subsidizing and ushering into the 21st century. In the late 90s, the left was waning. They'd had some fat years under Clinton. They did not have a lot of new blood. And Obama came in this generational lull of the left, and he was probably a lot younger than a lot of the people he was around, who had been activists in the 60s and then frequently radicals in the 70s, like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn. And it's interesting to me that he's younger than these people, and yet he sort of represents the future of that entire movement. So when he was involved with these groups, instead of going into the corporate lifestyle, and he's talked about making that choice, they were at a waning point in their influence in the West. When the importance of George Soros in the long view is that Soros came along at a time when these groups needed a new direction. And he has helped subsidize, not only helped subsidize that new direction, he's really sort of driven it. And by the time Obama was running for office, there was an entirely new type of progressive activism coordinating and coalescing under the organizations that George Soros was either supporting or had simply started from scratch. So it's hard to pin down exactly what the connection is between Soros and Obama, because there are 1,000 little connections. If you look at the groups that support Barack Obama, every single one of them are a touchstone between Obama and George Soros. And Soros frequently funds projects which advance the agenda that Barack Obama is promoting in the White House. I would call them partners in most of their goals for America. And this also, I think, is a confusing thing to explain to people, because on the surface, these goals sound wonderful. Green jobs, transforming our economy into an economy that will be responsive to environmental crisis while creating work for people, while creating new forms of energy. These are all things that a large number of Americans feel they can get behind. But it's smoke and mirrors. And the real goal, I think, for Soros and for Obama is to weaken America's power. I think that both of them are people who are pathologically angry at America. And I don't want to figure out all the reasons why, but it's enough for me to know that they're working with organizations that are trying to destabilize the institutions that create social cohesion and keep our society together. And we have a society with very, very diverse populations in it. And if you exacerbate the conflict between those groups, you really can destroy this country very easily. We're not like a lot of European nations where everybody has a certain common cultural background. We're a polyglot country.
I'll quote David Horowitz. He says, puts it all in perspective, the issue is never the issue. The left makes a big deal about all of its various issues. The issue is always the revolution. The issue is a distraction. The issue is the technique. It's the methodology by which they slowly, carefully subvert our country, because their ultimate goal is socialism. And by socialism, I mean their ultimate goal, unchallengeable power and wealth for them at the expense of everybody else. Because that's truthfully what socialism really is. And when you scrape away all the rhetoric and all the flowery motives of some of the true believers, what you find out is that there's a core group of individuals who see this as a perfect vehicle for obtaining untold wealth and power that they could never get otherwise. And there's a specific methodology to do that. And the Cloward-Piven strategy is a central component of that. Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven are two university professors. They are lifelong socialists, and in fact, Richard Cloward died in 2001. He was at Columbia. She was at Columbia for a time and has been at City University of New York since then, and I believe she still teaches there part-time. They were co-founders of Democratic Socialists of America, and they're almost legends in the far-left movement, although average people have probably never heard their names. In 1966, they wrote a seminal article called "The Weight of the Poor, A Strategy to End Poverty." In this article, they elucidate a strategy that collapse the government and provide them with the pretext for demanding fundamental change at the national level. Fundamental change was socialism, but they called it a guaranteed national income. What they wanted was a guaranteed national income for all citizens. And the way they proposed achieving that goal was to overload the welfare system with demands for services. They knew that there were so many welfare benefits available, the government could never meet all of its promises. But they also knew that very few people availed themselves of that. So their goal was to jam the welfare system with beneficiaries and hopefully create such a budgetary explosion that the government would collapse of its own weight. And then in the chaos that followed, they would demand fundamental change at the national level. And they created an organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization, headed by a black radical named George Wiley. And they recruited street thugs, black street activists, to go in and crash welfare offices around the country. And they were very successful. They radically expanded welfare rolls throughout the 60s, many magnitudes. In the cities, they focused specifically in New York City. By the time the National Welfare Rights Organization was done, there was one person on the welfare rolls in New York City for every 2 people working in the private sector. And it's credited with causing near bankruptcy of New York City in 1975. And so this strategy of theirs was dangerous, effective, and they clearly elucidated that their goal was to collapse the system. They wanted systematic chaos, and they say that. The title, "The Weight of the Poor," has very definite significance. People think of that term, the weight of the poor, as the burden of the poor. When you read it, that's what automatically you think, the weight of the poor. How are they ever going to get out from under their heavy burdens? What it really refers to is a Trotskyite concept of weight as power. The poor have power by their very size, by their very omnipresence. There's a lot of poor, and if they can be organized, they can be powerful. That's the significance of weight in this article.
Now, there are some people that have come out too. There were some former ACORN board members that came out and talked about the stuff that they heard. They're still Democrats, so they're not reporting everything. And that was one of the reason why we don't work together anymore, because when I converted, I couldn't continue to protect Obama and just expose ACORN. To really expose ACORN, you have to put it all out there, and that takes out almost half the Democrats that are in office right now. So it's a politics thing, and they told me, we know ACORN's bad, but you can't talk about Obama, or you can't talk about the Democrats, and that's why there's a silence on that side. We have to take out the politics. And some people believe that, right and wrong can be pushed aside for the good of the cause. And the cause right now is keeping the Democrats in power. So we're working on it. And I say that anyone, if there's liberals that are on the fence, it's easy to pull them over because you can always tell they're the ones that still have that sense of moral obligation. And if you get them before they become what we call true believers, then it's okay. When they're true believers, that's the Rachel Maddow's of the world, and it's too late. Oh. I'm just kidding. That was just a dig at Rachel Maddow. But thank you. Acorn would make you think that it was black people organizing black people in their communities. Well, what people didn't realize is that when I was there were only 2 blacks on national staff. The rest of them were young, white, liberal trust fund babies. And they would teach them how to go out to these communities and organize. And it's not that hard. As long as you knock on that door and say, I want to find out what you care about, it's easy. The only reason some of those people joined Acorn is that they were the only people that asked. Right before Obama was elected, that was my end with Democrats. That was my complete end, is when he started picking his cabinet. Now keep in mind, I've been in the liberal world for a number of years and worked with all of these different organizations. I also work with American Rights at Work. That's a group that has Hilda Solis was on their board. Hilda Solis was put in for Secretary of Labor. And then you've got Leon Panetta. Kathleen Sebelius came in as Health and Human Services Secretary. I knew all of these people. I knew their connections. I knew what they were up to. And that's when I realized Obama was not a good person because he was surrounding himself with all the crooks that have been in these organizations for years. So that's when I said, I'm done, I'm through. And I called myself an ex-liberal because I didn't like the Republicans. I did not definitely want to be a Republican. And I still, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't agree with a lot of things from the Republican Party. Neither do we. 2005, I found a job working with Acorn Political Operations and its sister organization, Project Vote. It was the organization that Obama worked with in the 90s. They were in the same office. And when I got there, they told me, oh, you're working with Acorn. So all I had heard was Acorn, 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 Acorn. When I got there, they told me about Project Vote. And the reason why that's significant is that Project Vote is a separate organization, technically. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, which means it's tax exempt. It's not supposed to engage in partisan political activity. What I found out is not only was I working for Acorn, but at the same time I was working for Project Vote on partisan activities and getting paid out of the nonprofit account. I didn't understand all of this at first because I was a newbie at Works. And along the way, I was given several troubling assignments. The first one was to research the voter fraud allegations in 2004. I don't know if you guys remember how contentious that election really was for the Democrats, but they had such hatred for Bush that George Soros had put millions of dollars behind this election because he wanted Kerry to win. They started these organizations called America Coming Together, or ACT. There was another one called America Votes. All of those were funded out of the Open Society Institute, Democracy Alliance, and included Acorn, Project Vote, SCIU, Emily's List, Planned Parenthood, and a host of other liberal organizations. What they did in 2004 was massive voter registration fraud on a scale that had not been seen since the 60s. So I had to sit there and try to research all of these allegations in 2005 and come up with a defense. And the more I researched it, the more I found out, yes, these people were guilty as sin. And yes, no matter what state they were in, they all seemed to do the same thing. It was almost like they were trained that way. But Acorn, discarding all the research I did, had me write up that in each case, it was one lone employee, or in the case of Missouri, 9 lone employees that got together and decided to defraud Acorn and turn in these fraudulent registrations, and it wasn't their fault. They threw these employees under the bus and they kept it moving. That's exactly what they did every single time. No one ever paid attention to the fact that this seemed to be systemic, and it was almost as they were creating a culture of fraud. So the employees were prosecuted. Acorn would go on to run another voter registration drive. The more you stay at Acorn, they tell you if you stay past a year, you get a gold watch because the attrition rate was so high. And the more you stay there, the more they trust you. So in 2006, I was given more responsibilities. I helped write the political plans for Colorado and Maryland and help with Ohio and work with the state directors across the country. I also started handling the money. And the more you handled the money, the more you got to see how things were working. All the grant checks that were coming in from organizations like Wellspring and the Tides Foundation and the Sandler Family Foundation out of California, They were coming in under Project Vote, tax-exempt money, and then being funneled into Acorn for partisan political activity. I went here in Maryland. Acorn personally put a hit out on him. I helped them come up with these PowerPoints and these slides that they used as door knockers, and they went out and they put them in the black communities, and there was pictures of Wynn hugging Bush or shaking Bush's hand, and it was that they were using the toxicness of Bush to go after Wynn, using me over here getting paid tax-exempt funds to do this partisan political activity. They destroyed Wynn and they put in Donna Edwards. Edwards was head of the ARCA Foundation, one of Project Vote's big donors, and she was also part of that coalition that was funneling this money between the organizations. All of this power that they were trying to create was political power. It was never about helping people. All they wanted to do was to get their people elected. And they weren't just looking big. It wasn't just the national offices. They were doing everything from county dog catcher to school board to assemblyman, anything that they could to get their people in place. Because once you got them in place, it was easy to get them to run for office. And the next thing you know, you're a congresswoman like Sheila Jackson Lee, who has no idea what she's talking about, seems to be kind of functionally illiterate, but there she is, representing, a state. Can you imagine some of these people that have been able to slip through the cracks? It's because they were Acorn people, and they were delivering those votes for them. Antonio Villarosa, he's the mayor of Los Angeles. He used to be the assemblyman of Los Angeles. He couldn't get the black vote until he partnered with Acorn. He lost the first time he ran for mayor. The second time he ran for mayor, he got over 45% of the black vote. He's Acorn's man in office. He wanted to run for governor, but Jerry Brown beat him to it. But imagine, in a couple of years, there could be Governor Villarosa, an Acorn man, and next thing you know, he's in national office. So this is how it works. It's all about power. It's all about a system of people that have so much to lose that they're not going to rat each other out. It's a tightly held network, and it goes all the way to the top. And that's what I learned in 2007.
Most people don't know this, but Cloward and Piven were the authors of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act that was passed by Bill Clinton, with Cloward and Piven standing directly behind him at the signing ceremony. That's when Acorn once again turned its attention to voting. Actually, the organization called Project Vote had existed for a number of years as well. Project Vote was Acorn's voter registration arm. And Project Vote began using National Voter Registration Act to flood election offices with registrations. And that is what Acorn has become best known for in recent years. Now, Project Vote is an interesting organization, and there are a lot of connections between President Obama and Project Vote. In 1992, as a newly minted community organizer, Barack Obama worked in the Illinois chapter of Project Vote and became very well known for registering 150,000 new voters, and that's generally credited with helping Carol Moseley Braun, the Democrat senator, to be elected that year. Now, she, of course, since had to resign under a cloud of corruption, but it was Barack Obama's efforts that helped get her elected, and he really made a name for himself in 1992, working for Project Vote. Voting is an individual responsibility. It's my responsibility to see that I'm registered. It's my responsibility to see that I vote. Well, the left doesn't believe that. The left says, no, the poor have been oppressed. The poor can't do it themselves. We have to do it for them. And they have to create that to set that precedent in law. So during the 80s, when people were very resistant to that, or they hadn't even gotten around to thinking about things that way, Human Serve did test lawsuits against state and local governments to attempt to create that legal precedent. And it took them 10 years, but ultimately they did it. And then when the National Voter Registration Act became law, now they had the force of law behind them, and Project Vote turned around and went after the state and local governments big time. essentially using that law as a whip to whip the states and local governments in line. It's simply incredible. The National Voter Registration Act should be abolished tomorrow, today. It's nothing more than A, a prescription for massive vote fraud, and B, a method for the left to recruit millions of voters on the taxpayer's dime. As most people know, or we should know at this point, despite the media blackout, Barack Obama has spent a lifetime working alongside Acorn, and he's said so publicly. Currently, many of the people on his staff have connections to Acorn. His former White House political director, Patrick Gaspard, was assistant to Bertha Lewis, who was the CEO of Acorn for a number of years. Patrick Gaspard's brother Michael is a general counsel for the Advance Group, which is an Acorn subsidiary. Francis Fox Piven is now on the board of directors of Project Vote. Francis Fox Piven was one of the early founders of Progressives for Obama. She was one of 130 radical founders of Campaign for America's Future, which is run by Robert Borisage, formerly of the Institute for Policy Studies. These are some of the hardest left organizations in the United States. Now, the Cloward-Piven chart that's up on the screen shows the connections between Barack Obama and the Cloward-Piven strategy. There's actually many more, so many more, you couldn't fit them all on a chart that's 10 times this size. But this one gets to the main meat of it. You have the crisis, the Cloward-Piven strategy introduced in the middle of the chart, and below that you have George Wiley's NWRO, the National Welfare Rights Organization, out of which came Wade Rathie's Acorn and Project Vote. And as we've said, Barack Obama worked extensively with Acorn and with Project Vote throughout most of his adult life. Most of those organizations are directly tied to the radical left. On the left-hand side of the chart, you see at the top the Communist Party USA and other radical socialist groups. Coming out of that, you see the New Left, the Diaper Babies, from which came the Students for a Democratic Society, which Wade Rathke was a member, Bill Ayers, who created the Weathermen, which was a split off from the SDS because SDS wasn't radical enough for Bomber Bill, and Carl Davidson, who was one of the founders of Progressives for Obama, and also he was a member of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. That was a break off from the Communist Party, and he helped found the New Party. The New Party was a socialist organization founded from party members, Acorn members, Committees of Correspondence members, SDS members, and it was what they call a fusion party, which allows a fusion party member to be on more than one ticket. And the New Party helped Barack Obama get elected to the Illinois Senate. That's why he joined the New Party. So there's another connection between Barack Obama and the radical left. Now, George Soros's Open Society Institute is headed by Aria Nair. Aria Nair was a leader in the SDS. And the Open Society Institute founds hundreds of radical left organizations, and as we know, George Soros is the puppet master behind Barack Obama. He funds many radical left organizations, and he helped fund Obama's election campaign in 2008, and no doubt he will be at it again in 2012. And that's just a side job for him. I mean, he's got so many different initiatives, they defy count. Now, on the right-hand side of the chart, you see Saul Alinsky at the top. Cloward and Piven were great acolytes of Saul Alinsky, the Alinsky radical community organizing method. And below Saul Alinsky is the Industrial Areas Foundation, he created that to train activists in community organization. Barack Obama was trained by three Industrial Areas Foundation veterans. And when you look down a little further, you see the Tides Foundation, the Woods Fund, the Chicago Annenberg Challenge. Tides Foundation funds Acorn. Barack Obama, when he was on the Woods Fund, he funneled money to the Tides Foundation, he funneled money to Acorn. He was actually on 5 separate nonprofit organizations at that time. They're not normally mentioned. We only get the Woods Fund and the Chicago Annenberg Challenge in most of the things we read about, but there were 3 other ones. And he wasn't only connected to Bill Ayers, who served on 2 of those boards. He was also connected to Mike Klonsky. Mike Klonsky was a radical Maoist communist, and Mike Klonsky's wife, Susan. And they all worked out of the same office building in Chicago. They all shared the same office space in Chicago. So when Barack Obama says that Bill Ayers was just a friend in the neighborhood, he's lying. I mean, it's flat out lying. He had an extensive relationship with all of these radical left communist individuals throughout the 90s and right up until he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and no doubt since then. And the Campaign for America's Future is connected to the Apollo Alliance. And if you remember, Van Jones, admitted communist Van Jones, who was Barack Obama's Green Jobs Czar, was also worked on the Apollo Alliance. And so there are many connections between the Campaign for America's Future and the Apollo Alliance, which still guides President Obama's Green Jobs Initiative.
Heather Heidelbaugh is a lawyer in Pennsylvania. She was suing the Secretary of State's office and Acorn regarding fraudulent registrations that had been turned in. Thousands and thousands of cards had flooded the offices in Pennsylvania to the point where the system had temporarily shut down for a while they were trying to process. She sued the Secretary of State for allowing these type of fraudulent applications to come in and allowing Acorn to do the same thing over and over again. She listened to me on the phone, and she didn't quite believe me. A liberal who was willing to talk about Acorn and had a connection to Obama, she just wasn't believing it. She thought maybe I was a plan or whatever. But she got in the car and drove from Pennsylvania up to D.C. and met with me. And after hearing my story, she put me on the stand against Acorn, and that was October 28, 2008. And that was the first time I ever got to get up and talk about how the voter fraud works, why it's about power, why it's about getting their people in office, and how it's also smoke and mirrors. Because while you're over here looking at Mickey Mouse and the starting lineup of the Dallas Cowboy, they are over here doing fraudulent absentee ballots, provisional ballots. The real fraud is not just in what they show on TV. It's what's going on behind the scenes, the thousands of cards that slipped through. Between 2003 and 2008, Acorn and its liberal groups, SEIU, Emily's List, Planned Parenthood, they registered over 7 million unmatched voters. And when I say unmatched, I mean there was nothing on the Republican or conservative end anywhere close to that. So when they talk about this landslide victory for Obama, they created the margin of victory in precincts across the country. A few 100,000 here, a few 100,000 there. They had these people who were looking at these absentee ballots, and they could tell if they weren't registered to vote. If they weren't voting. In New York, Acorn's Working Families Party was looking at people who hadn't voted for 2 and 3 years. They were ordering absentee ballots for those folks and then turning them in. Oh, we just found these thousands of ballots on election day. Right now, several key members have been indicted, as well as election officials in upstate New York. That just broke a couple of weeks ago. But that's through the Working Families Party and an investigation that has been going on for at least 2 years. That's where it all connects. And that's where we were in 2008, with a story that no one wanted to touch, that led back to massive voter registration fraud and led back to what we're looking at now, where they are rigging elections across the country. Laura Ingraham, I went on her show. She was one of the few people that was willing to listen to me, and I trusted her. Because I didn't want to do a run, I didn't want to go out there into real Fox News. But here was Laura, she was kind of on the side, and she was nice. And I'll never forget, after the interview, I was like, oh, I thought she was going to tear into me. He was like, what did you expect? I was like, And I told him, I said, these are conservatives. These are the Republicans. This is everything that I had been taught was evil and wrong. And that was the part that I still wasn't getting. My thought process was evolving, but I hadn't got to the point that I had been brainwashed yet. I still kind of believed and had faith in my party. When I was coming up, I tell people all the time, it was Jesus and JFK. Those were the two pictures on our wall. We were Democrats to the blood. We were Kennedy Democrats all the way through. But along the way, the party got away from us and we didn't realize it. So after going to CNN, and they did a 3-tape interview that never aired, we went to ABC News, Martha Raddatz. They had the information, wouldn't run with the story. So in 2009, we started pushing it out on Twitter, Facebook, and that changed my life. I had never interacted with people like you before. Coming out of college, I was all liberal with the bullhorn, and all my friends were liberal, and we had our little liberal, groups. We have my Facebook page. When I started talking about this stuff, you could tell the liberal ones because they would say something nasty and then they would just drop off my page. My friends were dropping like flies at this time. But I started finding new friends. I never thought that conservatives would find me funny or that we had stuff in common. It was like, I can't explain it to you, but it was coming away from all the stuff that I thought and realizing it wasn't that way.
In Baltimore City, the polls were completely unsupervised. There were no Republican poll watchers, and the poll judges, even though they were listed as Republicans, it turned out they were actually Democrats who just signed up as Republicans. In Maryland, you're supposed to have a Republican and a Democrat poll judge at every location. Well, all the ones in the Baltimore City area were actually Democrats. So there was no oversight whatsoever in any of those polls. And guess what? There were 5,000 votes that magically appeared, more votes than were cast in the entire election. And so vote fraud occurred in that year, in that manner. And we saw in 2010 in Houston when True the Vote attempted to surveil Houston. Massive vote fraud that I wrote about in my vote fraud article for Accuracy in Media. And there were plenty of poll watchers, and the poll judges in the Houston case, the Democrat poll judges, threw them out so they couldn't see what they were doing. And the Democrat poll judges were backed by roving bands of Houston New Black Panther Party members who, while dressed in 3-piece suits, nonetheless threatened poll watchers and poll judges and got anybody who wasn't on their side pushed out of the poll location. So these are the kind of things, and they're not for the faint of heart, but these are the kind of things we need to do to make sure this kind of fraud doesn't occur in 2012. We need poll watchers, we need poll judges, we need campaign workers, we need precinct workers, precinct captains. There's so many things you can do. If you go to my website, the DC Independent Examiner, I have posted there something called the Patriot's Handbook. And it's a large document, about 20 pages. It's 20 pages of recommendations about what you can do to be involved. And trust me, you can be an activist from your living room for 10 minutes a day, or you can be out there pounding the pavement or getting involved in a race or doing other things and be involved full time. And everything in between. There are all kinds of things you can do. And I would suggest to check that document out, print it out, share it, spread it around. It's free, and it has all kinds of great suggestions of what we can do. But whatever you do, get involved, because it's critical to the future of our country that we all be on hand, all hands on deck, to get a positive outcome in November.
And at the same time this was happening, we had moved 3 times. We had former Acorn employees telling me, oh, they're going to bring their big guns for you. You know, you can't do this. You're making us lose our jobs. All kinds of stuff coming at me from the left, calling me a coon, an Uncle Tom, an Ancient Mama, all types of evilness. On the right, I was experiencing people that were welcoming me and were saying, you're here, all we want you to do, tell your story, tell the truth. This is what we've always thought all along, and we need help. Started working with Smart Girl Politics, American Majority, and really just going around and talking about the reform. And my talk has evolved over the months that I've been telling it because I've gotten to understand it a little bit more. When I was there, I knew what I was doing and I knew that some things were wrong. Now that I go back and I teach people how to combat fraud, I realize there was much more wrong than I ever realized. That's where we're at right now. We're working on election integrity. And election integrity is so important because it's not just voter fraud. It's voter registration, it's voter rolls, it's precinct working, it's get out the vote. It all is part of election integrity. One citizen, one vote. We should not have people manipulating the system. Where we're at now, people don't realize that Acorn has been doing this for over 40 years. They're entrenched and they haven't gone away. When you look at these new groups that are popping up all across the country and they're working with groups like Emily's List and Planned Parenthood, and I stress those two because whenever you see a voter registration drive, Emily's List and Planned Parenthood are somewhere involved in it because they're pushing an agenda. It's always about the agendas. That's why the liberals are able to work together so well because, you know, the environmentalists and the pro-choice people and the gay rights movements, they all work together because they know they're pushing for a common goal. And that's what we've been trying to do for the past 2 years. Ever since O'Reilly played that voicemail of Stephanie Strong on the O'Reilly Factor, everything changed because Acorn realized they couldn't control the story anymore. They sued me for $5 million. At the time, I probably didn't have $5,000 to give them, and that was their excuse, their attempt to shut me up because it was becoming too effective. When we can ignore you on Twitter and Facebook and your blog, but now you're on O'Reilly, you're doing Fox News. I went on with Eric Shawn. This is too much. So they sued me in June of 2009. Working with great people from Kansas City, Graves, Baltimore, Marcus, and Garrett, and here in DC, the Center for Individual Rights. Not only were we able to get the lawsuit dismissed, but we set precedent for other bloggers. They sued me under violations of the Lanham Act. And that means that copyright violations for using their logo in what they called interstate commerce. But as a blogger, there weren't any ads on my page. I was putting that information out there to talk about Acorn, not to make money. So the judge threw it out, and it set precedent because any blogger that is using a company's logo for a public service or public information cannot be sued for violation of the Lanham Act because it does not fall in interstate commerce if there are no ads on the page. And that is something that people have asked about since then, and it's important because that's how they try to shut us up. And I'm really glad that I'm able to work with American Majority and get the information out there. We're starting a whole new branch of the Election Integrity Project. Do you guys know that over 10 states are either considering or have pushed before their state legislatures voter ID bills? And in every one of those states, there's a group like Acorn or Project Vote that is speaking out against the voter ID bills and calling them racist. While we're trying to push laws to protect our country and to protect the integrity of our system, they're right back to undermining it, using laws against us like the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. I want everyone to know that the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, has a right of private action, and that's what we're teaching everyone. We have the right as citizens to demand and even sue the Secretary of State's offices across the country after giving them a 20-day notice period that they must maintain accurate voting rolls free of dead voters, inactive voters, voters that have moved. And that's why we're dangerous to the left, because we're out there, all the stuff that has been ignored for years, we're making them enforce it. The Help America Vote Act demands that these systems be able to be checked by either driver's licenses or social security numbers. Are they doing that? No. These are the type of things that we as citizens can sue for.
The American education system has basically failed in the mission of teaching the last 60 years of our country's history. You can go to grade school and high school and you can get a college degree in this country, and you can even get an advanced degree in the humanities or the social sciences in this country without ever really learning about communism. And so there's this enormous divide between people, and the divide shows up a lot when you talk to people who came from countries that the Soviet Union controlled. There are people in this country who can tell you what it was like to live under the late Soviet state. And those people, I've met some of them when I worked with refugees and immigrants, and to a person, they are frantic about what they see as the encroachment of communist ideas in our society. Meanwhile, people who've been through our education system are not alarmed. And that lack of alarm really frightens me, because it's a form of enforced ignorance. By the time the 60s generation began teaching in the schools, there was a radical shift to the left in education schools, particularly. And I don't think it's a surprise that somebody like Bill Ayers ended up working in the educational establishment. And I'm not at all surprised that Bill Ayers made his career working on curriculum. So he was somebody who was extremely powerful in the world of K-12 curriculum in the United States. He was the leader of an organization that was responsible for deciding what people who were learning how to become teachers would learn in their college careers, and then would therefore impart to children in the classrooms. And in recent years, organizations ranging from PBS Teachers to the Zinn Education Project to Rethinking the Schools have only made these trends more disturbing. If you've got a child or a grandchild in the schools in the United States, there's a high probability that they are getting materials from PBS Teachers and possibly from Rethinking the Schools or the Zinn Education Project. And these organizations don't tell the whole story about communism, or they tell a story that's overtly wrong about it. They equate the United States to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. They don't explain who Stalin was. They talk a lot about the United States internment camps during World War II, but you don't get lessons about the Soviet internment camps or the gulags. Your average school teacher in America is not somebody who hates America, is not somebody who's radicalized, but they have been, if they've been through the education system, the way that we educate teachers, they've been taught to teach our history in a way that is really quite radical. And there isn't an alternative offered. And this is the thing that scares me the most going into the future, because I am just one generation removed from people actually learning the truth about the Soviet Union, about communism. And people in my generation never really heard that story. A couple of generations from now, will there be any way to even find that story out? The direction we're moving in education, not just college education anymore, but even K-12 education, leaves me very discouraged. If we don't find some way to take back the schools and explain and tell the truth about the history of the Cold War, there's not going to be anybody left who's able to receive that information in the way it needs to be received.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America.
I firmly believe that our nation will go the way of Cuba. It will go the way of Vietnam. It will go the way of every country that has been slowly subverted by communism. Barack Obama was chosen because the left has found a bottomless well of advantages in pursuing calling the race card. And Barack Obama gets away with doing much more radical things than anybody, including even Bill Clinton, could do. And Hillary Clinton could have done had she been elected, simply because he is black, because nobody wants to be critical. Nobody wants to criticize a black. For that reason, I called him the affirmative action president. And that's not a slight. He's very competent. He's very capable. He has been schooled all his life in these radical left techniques. He knows what he's doing. He's not an idiot. He's not incompetent, as a lot of people like to portray him. He's following a strategy. It's a strategy that has been in operation for decades. It was conceived over decades, and the radical left has been pursuing it, sometimes overtly, most of the time covertly. And he was raised from a young age on those ideas, on those ideologies. You can't overemphasize the significance of his mentoring by Frank Marshall Davis for 8 formative years of his life. Frank Marshall Davis was a member of the American Communist Party. Frank Marshall Davis was a Soviet agent. Frank Marshall Davis was under surveillance by the FBI for most of his adult life. That is not insignificant.
The whole story of Barack Obama and our involvement unraveling the mystery really started when I discovered that a blogger as far away as New Zealand by the name of Trevor Loudon had uncovered a very interesting reference to Obama. The reference was contained in a speech by a Communist Party writer named Gerald Horne when he was speaking at the Tamiment Library in New York City upon the acceptance by that library of the archives of the Communist Party. And what Trevor saw, and has written a great book called Barack Obama and the Enemies Within, Trevor follows the Communist Party, the Marxists, the progressive sources of information and news, and he came upon this Gerald Horne speech. But this became really the key to unraveling who Barack Obama was and his connections to the Communist Party USA. We've got a communist writer talking about the acceptance of these archives, looking back, but also looking to the future of the Communist Party. I want to make an essential point that many people forget. The Communist Party USA was a pawn of Moscow. It was funded and controlled by the old Soviet Union, the old Soviet Communist Party. So we're dealing with an organization that engaged in subversion and even espionage, because the Communist Party historically provided its members to serve in an espionage capability for the Soviet Union inside the United States government. He talks about somebody in Hawaii who was deploring the convictions of the members of the Communist Party as agents of influence for the old Soviet Union. Deploring these convictions in Hawaii was an African-American poet and journalist by the name of Frank Marshall Davis, who was certainly in the orbit of the CP, the Communist Party, if not a member. Now, of course, we found out later, yes, indeed, Frank Marshall Davis was a longtime member of the Communist Party, and Gerald Horne probably knew that, but didn't want to talk about it openly at this point. Remember, this is back in 2007. Referring to Davis, who was born in Kansas and spent a good deal of his adult life in Chicago before decamping to Honolulu in 1948 at the suggestion of his good friend Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was known as the Black Stalin. He was a secret member of the Communist Party and a supporter of Stalin, the mass murderer. Had actually taken the fifth before a congressional committee when questioned about his membership in the party. We know he was a member, a secret member, for 2 reasons. A defector from the party named Manning Johnson had said he had seen Robeson at meetings of the Communist Party, and that indeed Robeson was a member. And then after Robeson died, the Communist Party itself came out of the closet and said, yeah, Paul Robeson had been a member all along. Frank Marshall Davis going from Chicago to Hawaii at the suggestion of Paul Robeson. Eventually, he Davis befriended another family, a Euro-American family that had migrated to Honolulu from Kansas. And a young woman from this family eventually had a child with a young student from Kenya, East Africa, who goes by the name of Barack Obama, who, retracing the steps of Davis, eventually decamped to Chicago. And then in his best-selling memoir, Dreams of My Father, the author speaks warmly of an older black poet he identifies simply as Frank, as being a decisive influence in helping him to find his present identity as an African American. Horne goes on, after connecting Barack Obama to Frank Marshall Davis, to say the following: at some point in the future, a teacher will add to her syllabus Barack's memoir and instruct her students to read it alongside Frank Marshall Davis's equally affecting memoir, Living the Blues. And when that day comes, I'm sure a future student will not only examine critically the Frankenstein monsters that U.S. imperialism created in order to subdue communist parties, but will also be moved to come to this historic and wonderful archive, he's referring to the Communist Party archives at Tamiment, in order to gain insight on what has befallen this complex and intriguing planet on which we reside. Now, it's almost, again, like Gerald Horne is predicting Obama's going to be an historical figure. In fact, going to be President of the United States. This is in 2007. And he makes that connection again. This is the first time we had known about it publicly, between Frank Marshall Davis, who he says is in the orbit of the CP, but was actually a prominent member, and Barack Obama. Now remember, Obama is considering a run for president at this point, but it's not during the campaign. This is again in 2007, where people are thinking about running and so forth and so on. Again, Trevor Loudon in New Zealand, of all places, notices this. And he says, my gosh, that's big news. This is amazing. And so he writes a column about this on March 29th, 2007. And here's how he put it. The Communist Party USA is claiming Barack Obama as its spiritual heir. U.S. academic Gerald Horne, a member of the editorial board of the CP USA's theoretical journal, Political Affairs, wrote this piece in its latest online version. Trevor Loudon says, my gosh, this is big news about possibly somebody who could become the next president of the United States. Obama's then a senator from Illinois, considering a run for president. A lot of people think he was planning to run for president when he became senator. Meantime, here I am in Washington, D.C., working for Accuracy in Media. I've been associated with AIM for 30 years. And I didn't know Trevor Loudon at that point. But that particular blog post comes to my attention. I say, this is big news. Now, this is almost a year later. This is in 2008. And I'm thinking, well, you know, that's interesting that Trevor Loudon, I made his acquaintance. We have since become close friends and associates. But at the time, I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. He picks up on this, but how do we really know this guy Frank in Obama's book is really Frank Marshall Davis, as Gerald Horne says he is? And this is the book, of course, by Obama, Dreams from My Father, in which he certainly refers to this guy Frank, this poet, this writer, who gives him advice on life, what to do in terms of going to college, how to deal with life experiences. And we later, of course, find out that Frank is Frank Marshall Davis and was a mentor to Obama for about 8 years. And so we've got the book, but we, of course, have the fact that Obama himself didn't want people to know who really Frank was. Now we've got Gerald Horne saying, oh, it's Frank Marshall Davis. We've got Trevor Loudon picking up on that, but see, I have to say, as a journalist, and I was trained in journalism, I graduated in journalism, I'm thinking, really, I'm not going to get on the phone and get Barack Obama to comment on this. We've got Gerald Horne talking about this, but he's just one source. He may be right. He may have some inside information, but is it necessarily true? Is it true that Frank is really Frank Marshall Davis? Could it be another Frank somewhere? I mean, you never know. I pick up the phone and start calling in Hawaii, and where Davis had served as Obama's childhood mentor. And I find there's a professor named Catherine Takara who had written a long treatise on Frank Marshall Davis. So clearly she knew who Frank Marshall Davis was. She knew all about him, and she had her own sympathetic view of him. But at this point, I call her up and say, we've got this report that the Frank in Obama's book is really Frank Marshall Davis. Clearly, you wrote about Frank Marshall Davis. You knew him. Is this the same Frank Marshall Davis who's Frank in Obama's book? She says, yeah, that's him. Yeah, they had a relationship. They knew each other. He was an advisor, an influence over Obama's life. And so at that point, I thought, look, we got two sources now confirming that Frank is Frank Marshall Davis. Moreover, once we confirm that, we go into some other sources about Davis. Remember, Davis has been dead for a while. And we confirm that Davis, not just being in the orbit of the CP, Communist Party, was actually a member. We find out he was a member for quite some time. We're not sure at that point how long, but according to his biographer, John Edgar Tidwell, Davis was a member. He was a member to the point after the Nazi-Stalin Pact. Davis was, in other words, a hardcore communist. Not only wasn't bothered by that, but became a supporter of Joseph Stalin as well. So at that point, I felt I had enough to go on. We've got enough source material. I end up writing an article. This appears on February 18th, 2008, appearing on the Accuracy in Media website. And it's titled, I put this title on it, Obama's Communist Mentor. And I'll tell you, this story to this day is the most accessed article on the AIM website. It's gone everywhere. Because although Trevor had broken the story in a way, we had confirmed it, and we had additional source material, and this really broke the story wide open. And remember, this is in February 2008, months before the election. Not that we're trying to influence the election one way or the other, but we think this is certainly information people need to know about a potential Democratic Party candidate. Again, we confirm this in terms of credible original source material with Dr. Catherine Takara. She had been a professor of interdisciplinary studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She had done her dissertation on Davis. So at that point, we had a heck of a story, and we knew it. And we were waiting for the media to cover it. And they weren't anxious to do that. Eventually, there were a couple books done during that election year, one by Jerry Corsi, one by David Freddoso, on Obama, that mentioned the Davis connection. Jerry, in particular, gave us a lot of credit for developing this story. But it was more than just confirming that, hey, Barack Obama was influenced by a Communist Party member. Because I found out through one of the footnotes in one of John Edgar Tidwell's books on Davis that there was an FBI file on Davis. Now, Tidwell didn't go into much about the file. Remember, Tidwell was sympathetic to Davis. He had written glowingly about him, how great a poet he was, a great writer, so forth and so on. But that gave me the tip-off that, hey, there was a file that existed. What could it say? Now, the fact that he had referred to a file made me aware of the fact that it had already been processed by the FBI and released. That was critical, because I thought if I had to ask for a file at that point, early in 2008, through the Freedom of Information Act, it could take years, if ever, to get the file. But I knew, I referred to this in my what's called a FOIA request to the FBI, the fact that it had been processed. And sure enough, we end up getting the file from the FBI in August 2008, 600 pages. 600 pages. We have posted the whole file at usasurvival.org. We held a conference about it in Washington, D.C. at the time. This followed up a previous conference about Frank Marshall Davis himself and what we knew then about his involvement in the conflict. But suffice it to say, it shows that Davis was under FBI surveillance for about 19 years, that he was a high-level member of the party, that he may even have been involved in espionage, and that he was of such a mentality or character that he was on a certain list, a security index they call it at the FBI, so that if there was a war with the Soviet Union or a national emergency, Davis could have been arrested and detained. That's how serious a figure Davis was. So we had the 600-page file on Davis. We had the confirmation of his identity. We were holding conferences in Washington, D.C. with such experts as Herb Romerstein, longtime congressional investigator, with Trevor Loudon, and with others, trying to get this story out because the media were not doing their job of investigating Obama's background. Now, at one of these conferences in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post reporter shows up and basically laughs at us, suggesting we were holding a UFO convention. Like, this is just, Kincaid's office rocker. What are you talking about this kind of stuff for? McCarthyism. This is, the media don't cover these things anymore. But we knew it was a story. As a journalist myself, we had to pursue the facts. And it got so bad in trying to get this story out that I tried to take out paid ads on the internet to draw attention to what we had discovered. Now, one place I went to was the Drudge Report. Now, that's considered by many to be a conservative news site run by Matt Drudge. I tried to pay Matt Drudge $5,000 to run ads on the Drudge Report calling attention to our findings about Frank Marshall Davis. One of the ads showed a picture of Davis and a hammer and sickle, and it asked, "Who is this man?" It was intriguing, it was provocative, but certainly in good taste and well within the bounds of what we had discovered, what we knew, what we could document, what we could prove. The ad was rejected. I was told by Matt Drudge's representatives that it was just too controversial. Now, this is what we were facing. Again, now we're talking about the fall of 2008. We've held news conferences. We've tried to take out ads. We've got all of these documents up on our website. And even the conservative media are saying, we're not interested. We can't cover that. Too controversial. Fortunately, two of those books, the one by Corsi, the one by Freddoso, did mention a little bit. Corsi's book more so than the other. But let's face it, it wasn't enough. It didn't get out into the major media. And to this day, 4 years later, many people are not aware of who Frank Marshall Davis was and his influence over Obama. Now, it's interesting, too, to look back when these books came out, especially Jerry Corsi's book, Obama Nation. The Obama campaign reacted to it, not by denying that Frank was Frank Marshall Davis. They had to admit that. We knew that was a fact. They said, well, Frank was just a civil rights activist. They didn't really deny that he had been a member of the Communist Party, but they said, oh, he was just a civil rights activist, and regarded anything to the contrary as a smear of Obama. So this is how they handled it. They basically tried to whitewash Davis as just some sincere, legitimate civil rights activist. So what's the big deal of him having any influence over Barack Obama? Well, the fact is, 4 years later, I think we understand more so the significance of this revelation, because Obama, it's been clear to many people, has a Marxist agenda. Now, I'm not going to say that we have any evidence of Obama being a member of the Communist Party. We don't. But we do know he was under the influence of Davis for about 8 years. We know that he has never, to our knowledge, been asked about this by anybody in the media. Nobody's bothered to raise it with him. We've had a mini controversy recently over whether Obama told the truth in his memoir about the number of girlfriends he had. But I don't care if he had 1 or 2 or 3 or who they were. I mean, the issue is the philosophy or mentality that Obama embraced, which has driven his policies as President of the United States domestically and in international relations. So the mystery of Frank Marshall Davis and his influence over Obama has not been fully told even at this point 4 years later, and we have new revelations coming out that suggest that, contrary to what Gerald Horne said, Davis may not just have been a mentor to Obama, but his real father. Now, new film's out called Obama's Real Father by Joel Gilbert that goes into this in much detail. And of course, it's not a clear-cut case of, hey, we have DNA evidence proving this is the case. But it is something to see and something to consider and ponder. But whether Davis was Obama's real father or not, or just a mentor, his influence over Obama is undeniable. Remember, even if Barack Hussein Obama Sr. was the real father, he wasn't a part of Obama's life. He basically abandoned the family or left. You can look at it in different ways. And that's why Obama's grandfather, Stanley Dunham, picked Frank Marshall Davis to be Obama's mentor. Because Dunham thought that a young Barack Obama in Hawaii at the time needed a black role model, needed a mentor, somebody he could relate to, and that was Frank Marshall Davis. And again, you can go through Obama's book, Dreams from My Father, to talk, in which he was then just referring to Davis as Frank, but he talks about Frank's influence, talking to him about college, about racial relations, all kinds of things. Now that's just what Obama admits. And we know over a period of 8 years there was much more talked about than just those few things. We are convinced, based on Obama's record in office, that Davis had a major influence over Obama in so many areas, domestic, foreign policy, and we know from one of his colleagues at Occidental, where Obama first went to college, that by the time Obama got to college, he was a full-fledged Marxist revolutionary. So where did Obama get that? Frank Marshall Davis. And so this is a story that even at this late date, 4 years after Obama's been elected, the media don't want to touch. They really don't want to get into it. Fortunately, we've got somebody like a Joel Gilbert doing this new film on Obama who's willing to tackle some hard questions. Some of it's informed speculation. We can't prove a lot of it, but it's worthy of consideration at this point because Obama's been so secretive about his real history. But we also have somebody like a Paul Kengor, professor from Grove City College, author of the great book, many great books, including books on Reagan, but he also wrote the book Dupes, on how progressives have been duped by the communists. His new book on Frank Marshall Davis, trying to, again, get to the bottom of this, what kind of influence Davis had. It's very disconcerting and troubling in so many ways, because not only of the ideological influence, but the influence over Obama in other ways. And this is one thing that we had gotten into, again, in late 2008, before the election, when we discovered that Frank Marshall Davis was a sex pervert and a pornographer. And he had written a book called Sex Rebel Black, in which he talked about having all kinds of perverted sex, including sex with young girls, one of which he referred to as a girl named Anne. Now, one of the troubling things that's brought up in Joel Gilbert's film is that it's possible that this Anne that Frank Marshall Davis had sex with, a young girl, was in fact Ann Dunham, Obama's mother, and that Frank Marshall Davis indeed is Obama's real father. Again, I come to no conclusions on this, but we did find out at that point that Davis was a pornographer. And this is not disputed. Even Obama's sympathetic biographer, John Edgar Tidwell, admitted this. Yeah, he wrote the pornography. There's even another pornographic novel that I guess hadn't been published that he had written. But that also raised some questions about the kinds of pornography Davis was into, and raises questions about whether he showed it to a young Barack Obama, and to what extent Obama himself as a young teenager got pulled into these activities. Not just the communist indoctrination, but the sexual perversion. One of the things that was troubling to me when we started getting on the trail of Davis was the references to pornography, but also when I looked at the Frank Marshall Davis archive at Washington University in St. Louis, where they had been transferred from Hawaii. Now we can assume that the Davis archives have been sanitized to keep some of the more objectionable stuff out, but there's a lot there. And what I found going through all this material, and there's recordings of Davis, interviews of Davis, clippings, articles by Davis in which he talks about, for example, his friendship with Paul Robeson. I find going through all these clippings and materials, nude photos of women that Davis had taken. Knowing that Davis had written the pornographic novel Sex Rebel, this wasn't a complete surprise, but in context, it helps me understand the controversy over some photos that first emerged several years ago, and which are in Joe Gilbert's film called Dreams from My Real Father, that purport to show Obama's mother, Ann Dunham, posing in the nude. These are nude photos that had circulated initially several years ago. I had seen them and thought, well, they could be fakes, manufactured. Somebody said they were not Ann Dunham, they were actually of an actress, somebody else. Gilbert makes the point in his film, and he compares the pictures of the person in the photos with pictures we know of Ann Dunham. That's the same person. So she did pose for nude photos taken by Frank Marshall Davis, and he connects the scene to what we know about Davis's own home, the couch, the records. There are certain things that can be traced back to Davis's home. And so I guess it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to think that Davis and Ann Dunham may have had sexual affairs together, or may have been involved on another level in this business. And that's a troubling aspect that I guess is probably even more or equally as controversial as the communist connection. Because again, remember this, we're talking about a young man, Barack Obama, a teenager, young boy really, up until his teens. And then he went off to Occidental College, who was exposed to all of this. He was exposed to all the communist ideology. He was exposed to perhaps the pornography. Then we find out on top of that Davis was a big drinker. He drank a lot, and according to one report, was a doper, smoked a lot of dope. So this is the milieu Obama comes out of, and may help explain a lot in terms of Obama's policies as president and what he got involved in, but which he and his aides and staff, of course, don't want to talk about. And that's why some of this is speculative, I understand. I don't come to any necessary conclusions other than that we know who Davis was. We know he was a Communist Party member. We know he was Obama's communist mentor. Some of the other stuff, a little bit more iffy, but we do know Davis was a pervert and a pornographer. I mean, can you imagine turning over your own son to the influence of somebody like that? This was a big influence over how Obama turned out in life. I mean, does that help us understand or explain his policies as president? I think this is something that has to be addressed. And except though for a few people in the conservative media, and especially blogger Trevor Loudon, and a few authors, and those who have picked up the work we've done, this is still a taboo subject.